Many people think there's a conflict between science and religion. I'm sure that most of you are aware of this. When people find out that I am a scientist and a religious believer, they sometimes ask me whether I find any difficulty in reconciling the two. I've always found that a strange question. I'm a scientist for many of the same reasons that I'm religious. A sense of wonder, a passionate desire to know the reason behind things, a belief that there is a reason behind things, and a deep conviction that everything holds together in some coherent way. For me, both the Catholic faith and modern science make sense of the world. Science tells us about the things that we can observe and measure. Our faith has a much wider scope and answers deeper questions. Questions about the ultimate cause of the world's existence and order, the purpose of human life and our ultimate destiny. It tells us about spiritual realities, about God and man, love and truth, good and evil, sin and redemption. The Catholic faith and empirical science are two perspectives on reality that see things in different ways, but not in conflicting ways. I've been a Catholic for 72 years and a scientist for 48 years, and I know of no scientific fact that conflicts with any Catholic doctrine. So why do so many people think that there is a conflict or that science and religion are at odds with each other? There are several reasons. Some people have misconceptions about science and what it has discovered. Many people have misconceptions about what various religions actually teach. This is certainly true of Catholicism. Not all Catholics have an accurate knowledge of what their own faith teaches. Some people just lump all religion together in an undifferentiated mass. Every example of a superstitious belief or magical practices that they come across is evidence to them of the irrationality of all religion. A very common error, many of the new atheists made it, is a failure to distinguish between science itself and a certain philosophy that is often called scientific materialism. Oops. Let me see, am I doing this right? There we go. Pushed the wrong button. What is scientific materialism? Well, I don't have to tell you here at TAC. Materialism is the idea that all of reality is reducible to matter and its behavior. Scientific materialists are people who falsely think that materialism is somehow implied by modern science and what it has discovered. This is an opinion that is indeed held by many scientists and by many people who claim to speak in the name of science. But it has no claim to being science. It is, as I said, a philosophical opinion. Now, if matter were the only reality, then of course, God would not exist, nor would human spiritual souls. A human being would be nothing more than a complex structure made of atoms. And everything about a human being would be ultimately explicable in terms of the laws of physics that govern how those atoms behave. In other words, scientific materialism implies not only that God does not exist, but that strictly speaking, you don't exist either, at least not in the way you thought you did. The popular astronomer and science writer of an earlier generation, Carl Sagan, put it this way in one of his books: I am a collection of water, calcium, and organic molecules called Carl Sagan. Francis Crick, co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, wrote in one of his books, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll Alice might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. Now, for some of its adherents, well, those who say that science and faith are in conflict have three kinds of arguments: philosophical, historical, and scientific. Their philosophical claim is that there is an inherent contradiction between the scientific and religious outlooks. Science is based on reason and evidence, whereas religion, they say, is irrational because it is based on dogma, faith, and mystery, which involve belief in things that cannot be seen and for which supposedly there is no evidence. Science is based on natural explanations and natural laws, whereas religion is based on miracles and the supernatural. They see religion as a matter of myth and magic, and therefore the very antithesis of a rational scientific outlook. Their historical claim is that religious believers and institutions have been hostile to science and have tried to suppress it. This is powerfully symbolized in the eyes of many by the Catholic Church's treatment of Galileo. And this impression is constantly reinforced in the public mind by the never-ending battle against evolution waged by fundamentalist Protestants. The materialist scientific claim is that the actual discoveries of modern science over the last 400 years have debunked or undermined basic Christian beliefs about the universe and humanity's place in it. As the story is often told, science has dealt one blow after another to the religious conception of the world. Copernicus showed that we are not at the center of the universe. Newtonian physics showed that nature has no purposes or goals, but is purely mechanical and governed by blind and impersonal forces. Modern astronomy showed how small and insignificant we are compared to the cosmos as a whole. Darwin, some say, showed that human life is an accident and that human beings differ only in degree from lower animals. Advances in neuroscience and artificial intelligence are thought to be demonstrating that the supposed soul is nothing but the working of the brain, a complex biological computer. And modern cosmology is invoked to show either that the universe had no beginning or that the universe created itself out of nothing by a quantum fluctuation. Now, in this talk, I'm going to focus primarily on the philosophical and historical claims that religion and Christianity in particular are inherently contrary to science and historically have been its enemies. In the last part, if I have time, I will discuss some of the things modern physics has discovered and argue that they're more consonant with what Christians and other theists believe than with materialism and atheism. So let's begin with the opposition, the supposed opposition between the supernaturalism of religion and the naturalism of science. It is certainly true that biblical religion and most other religions involve belief in supernatural entities and events. However, the biblical religions have never been based on supernaturalism, if we mean by that a rejection of the idea that there is a natural order, that there are natural phenomena and natural causes. In fact, biblical scholars tell us that the book of Genesis was in part an attack on the false supernaturalism and superstition of ancient pagan religion. When Genesis said that the sun and moon were merely lamps placed by God in the heavens to light the day and night, it was not proposing an alternative to modern astrophysics, it was attacking the pagan religions that worshipped the sun and moon. When Genesis said that man is made in the image of God and is to exercise dominion over other created things, Genesis was, among other things, attacking the pagan religions in which human beings worshipped and bowed down to created things, or to gods made in the image of created things. In paganism, the world was filled with occult forces and populated by numerous deities, gods and goddesses of the oceans and forests, of wind and fire and lightning, of sex and fertility, and so on. Jews and Christians, however, taught that there is one God, only one God, who was to be sought not within nature, not within its phenomena and forces, but a God who is beyond nature, outside of nature, a God who is indeed the author of nature. In this way, biblical religion stripped the physical universe of divinity and made it into a natural world, no longer the abode of gods, but merely the creation of God. And since God is good, the natural world was seen as something good and therefore worth studying. And since God is intelligent and wise, the world he made must reflect this. It must therefore have been made according to principles and laws that can be discovered and understood by reason. Biblical religion then taught that there is a natural order which comes from God. And what characterizes this natural order and reflects the rationality of its creator is precisely that it is orderly, harmonious, beautiful, and lawful. Consider this passage from the letter of Clement to the church in Corinth, written around 97 AD. This is a very short excerpt of a very long letter. The heavens, as they revolve beneath his government, do so in quiet submission to him. The day and the night run the course he has laid down for them. Sun, moon, and the starry choirs roll on in harmony at his command, none swerving from his appointed orbit. Laws of the same kind sustain the fathomless deeps of the abyss and the untold regions of the netherworld, the impassable ocean, and all the worlds that lie beyond it are themselves ruled by the like ordinances of the Lord. Upon all of these, the great architect and Lord of the universe has enjoined peace and harmony. Or consider this passage, one of my favorites, from the Christian apologist Minucius Felix, writing around 200 AD, in a work aimed at his pagan contemporaries to convince them to believe in a creator God. And he said, if upon entering some home, you saw that everything there was well tended, neat, and decorative, you would believe that some master was in charge of it, and that he was himself much superior to those good things. So too, in the home of this world, when you see providence, order, and law in the heavens and on earth, believe that there is a Lord and author of the universe, more beautiful than the stars themselves and the various parts of the whole world. Look at what these two passages point to as evidence of God. Not to supernatural phenomena or to miraculous departures from the order of nature, but to the order of nature itself and its lawfulness. This was actually the main argument, one of the main arguments given by ancient Christians for believing in a creator God. This, and the very fact that there is a universe at all. They said there must be a giver of order and there must be a giver of being. As I said, the arguments for a creator, fundamental arguments, are that there must be a cause. The arguments taken from the created world, from the physical universe, let's say, are primarily that there must be a cause of the universe's existence and a cause of its order. Moreover, this orderliness of nature is a lawful order. And if there's a law, there must be a lawgiver. That's the basic argument. God was the lawgiver not only to Israel, but to the cosmos itself. God says in Jeremiah 33:25, "When I have no covenant with day and night, and have given no laws to heaven and earth, then too will I reject the descendants of Jacob and of my servant David." Psalm 148 tells of God establishing the sun, the moon, the stars, and the heavens by a decree or law. The idea of God as rational lawgiver to the cosmos helped give birth to the idea that there are laws of nature. In fact, the specific idea that there are universal mathematical laws of physics, as we now call them, has Christian roots. It was first proposed, according to one historian, it was first proposed in the 17th century by René Descartes and Isaac Newton, who saw these laws as having been imposed upon matter by God. Now, some atheists are aware of this. For example, the eminent biologist Edward O. Wilson of Harvard, who died a few years ago, who's not a religious believer, suggested the following as the reason that Chinese civilization, for all its impressive achievements, scientific achievements, did not produce a Newton or a Descartes, or the idea of universal laws of physics. He said in his book Consilience, why no Newton or Descartes? Because Chinese scholars had abandoned the idea of a supreme being with personal and creative properties. No rational author of nature existed for them. Consequently, the objects they meticulously described did not follow universal principles. In the absence of a compelling need for the notion of general laws, thoughts in the mind of God, so to speak, little or no search was made for them. The well-known cosmologist, André Linde, who is not a religious believer, not a monotheist, has suggested that the notion of a universe governed by, quote, a single law in all its parts is historically rooted in monotheism. Now, the biblical religions do, of course, teach that there are supernatural realities that have effects in the world. An example would be divine grace. But the word supernatural, which means, of course, above the natural, would make no sense unless there were a natural order to begin with. In the concept of miracles, which are extraordinary events that go beyond what is naturally possible, presupposes that there is a natural order that determines what is naturally possible and what is not. There's no logical contradiction between the idea of a lawful universe and the idea of miracles. For the same lawgiver who established the laws of nature and can also suspend or override them, because he made the rules, he can make exceptions to them for the sake of some greater purpose. As we'll see, the men who led the development of modern science in its first few centuries, the pioneers in uncovering nature's laws, such as Isaac Newton, were almost all, virtually all, devout Christians who believed in miracles. Now, there's a lot of confusion today, even among religious believers, about how nature relates to God. Instead of seeing God as the author of nature, they see God and nature as somehow opposed or in competition with each other. So that if something has a natural explanation, then God has nothing to do with it. And if God is the cause of something, well, then it must be supernatural. Many therefore look for evidence of God only or primarily in what is outside the course of nature or inexplicable by natural science. That is, in the gaps in our scientific understanding, hence the expression, the God of the gaps. And atheists think that by closing those gaps in our scientific understanding of nature, they will leave no place for God to hide. But the traditional Christian view is quite different. If God, as creator of the natural world, established its laws and gave things their natural powers, then his existence is evidence in nature itself and its ordinary processes. Medieval theologians distinguished two ways in which God acts in the world. He can act directly in a supernatural manner, for example, turning water into wine, or he can accomplish his will through the operation of natural causes and processes, which in the terminology of theology are called secondary causes. It has always been the Christian view that God ordinarily acts in the latter, through secondary natural causes. In the words of the great theologian Francisco Suarez, who died about 400 years ago, quote, God does not interfere directly with the natural order where secondary causes suffice to produce the intended effect. This principle was important for the founding of science, for it implied that when confronted by some puzzling phenomenon or new phenomenon, we should look first for natural explanations. Superstitious people tend to see the supernatural in every unusual or strange event. But this was criticized by the great medieval scientist and theologian Nicholas Oresme. In explaining, who was, by the way, a real genius and generally recognized as having been a great mathematical scientific genius, he said, in explaining the marvels of nature, there's no reason, quote, there's no reason to take recourse to the heavens or to demons or to our glorious God as if he would produce these effects directly, any more than he directly produces those effects whose natural causes we believe are well known to us. Another great medieval scientist, Jean Buridan, wrote, the philosophers, which in those days included scientists were called philosophers in the Middle Ages, the philosophers explain such marvels by appropriate natural causes, but common folk, not knowing of causes, believe that these phenomena are produced by a miracle of God, which is usually not true. In other words, for Christians, the default explanation of events is natural causes, not the miraculous. That's why the Catholic Church does not declare purported miracles of saints worthy of belief until it has excluded the likelihood of natural explanations. Now this brings us back to the crucial theological distinction between primary and secondary causality. I think that the failure to understand this or grasp this is one of the main reasons that some people see a conflict between science and religion. This distinction is most simply explained, I think, by a simple analogy. By using the terms vertical and horizontal rather than primary and secondary cause. The analogy is to a novel or a play. In the play Hamlet, the character Hamlet kills the character Polonius, who is eavesdropping behind a curtain, by stabbing him through the curtain. So consider the following question. What caused Polonius' death? Let's take a vote. Have a little election here. Raise your hand if you think that Polonius died in the play Hamlet because Hamlet stabbed him through a curtain. Good. You're saying that I didn't lie to you. Now raise your hand if you think Polonius died because Shakespeare wrote the play that way. Okay. Intelligent audiences always laugh because they see the absurdity in having to choose. They're both correct. They're both completely correct explanations. They're not alternatives to each other. They don't exclude each other. Obviously, both the character Hamlet and Shakespeare are causes, but at different levels. Hamlet and his stabbing of Polonius is the cause within the plot of the play of Polonius' death, what one could call the horizontal cause, where Shakespeare is the vertical cause of the whole play and its entire plot, including, of course, the death of Polonius. Shakespeare is the cause of there being a play, of it containing the characters it does, including Hamlet and Polonius, of all the events of the play, including the stabbing of Polonius, and of all the relationships among those events and characters, including the various causal relationships among them within the plot. There is no competition or conflict between these two levels of causality, the horizontal and the vertical. By analogy, the natural causes within the universe, within its plot, so to speak, which are studied by everybody, and in a special way by scientists, are the horizontal causes, which theology calls secondary causes, while God, as the author of nature, is the vertical or primary cause. The analogy makes clear just how silly it is to treat evolution and creation as alternatives, as both fundamentalists and atheists do. Did this species of animal, this particular animal, this hippopotamus, or this giraffe, or this crocodile, did it come to be through a sequence of natural causes, such as sexual reproduction, such as biological evolution, or because God wrote it into the plot of the universe? Both. And this has always been the Catholic view. For example, a few years after Darwin's Origin of Species, now St. John Henry Newman wrote in a letter or a notebook, I forget which, if secondary causes are conceivable, an almighty agent being supposed, I do not see why the series of such causes should not last for millions of years as for thousands. This also makes clear why scientific materialists are wrong to think that theists believe without evidence, believe in God without evidence. For materialists, and the evidence means either directly observing the evidence that something exists comes from either directly observing it with our senses or inferring that it exists as a natural cause of what we observe. The way we directly observe a compass needle, but we infer the existence of a magnetic field as the natural cause of the compass needle moving. Now, of course, God cannot be seen in either of those ways because he is not a part of nature. He's not a part of the physical universe, which we could know by sense. Nor is he a natural cause within the universe, like a magnetic field. And yet God is a cause, the ultimate cause. He is not, however, a cause within nature. He is the cause of nature. Thus, nature gives evidence of God in the same way that a play or a novel gives evidence of its author, even if the author does not announce his existence in the plot of the novel or the play, or doesn't appear as a character in it. Now let's return to the historical critique of religion. The idea that Christianity, and the Catholic Church in particular, opposed science and tried to hold it back is called by historians the conflict thesis, or the warfare thesis. It has been rejected. It used to be believed even by most historians of science. But contemporary historians of science unanimously reject it as a myth. as a recent invention. The idea that science was born in conflict with religion and that there were two warring camps, the religious camp and the scientific camp, is projecting onto the past ideas that arose in the late 19th century, largely through anti-Christian and anti-Catholic polemics. In the first few centuries of modern science, the scientific people and the religious people were not two warring camps because almost all scientists were themselves religious. Consider the great figures of the scientific revolution. Virtually all of them, actually every single one of these, and they could have listed more, but these are maybe the most important. I left out a few very important ones. But all of them were religious. About half of them were Catholic, about half of them were Protestant. Copernicus, whose works sparked this scientific revolution, was an official of the Catholic Church. Johannes Kepler, a devout Lutheran, who was famous for his 3 laws of planetary motion, which I'm sure you study here, announced his discoveries with this prayer: I thank you, Lord God, our Creator, that you have allowed me to see the beauty in your work of creation. Galileo, despite his troubles with the church authorities, remained a practicing Catholic throughout his life. Descartes believed in God and that human beings possessed immaterial spiritual souls, and professed himself a Catholic. Blaise Pascal was not only a mathematician and physicist of genius, but a Catholic. He had Jansenist opinions, but it doesn't matter. Whose life had been transformed by a mystical experience, and who wrote in defense of Christian faith against religious skepticism. Robert Boyle, the first modern chemist and founder of chemistry, was a pious Anglican who said that he liked to do his scientific experiments on Sunday, as they are a form of worship. Isaac Newton, the greatest of them all, spent as much time on theological and scriptural studies as he did on physics and mathematics. All of them saw their work as showing the beauty of God's creation rather than as supporting atheism. And this was true well beyond the 17th century. For example, the greatest physicists of the 19th century, Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell, were deeply devout Protestant Christians. Moreover, the scientific revolution, I'm going to skip this part because the time is getting short. A little-known fact that dramatically illustrates the positive role the Catholic Church has played in the development of science is the large number of Catholic priests who made major discoveries, and including founding entire branches of science. I have time to mention only a few of the most outstanding. Nicholas Steno is famous was a priest who's famous in 3 branches of science: anatomy, crystallography, and geology. He was the greatest anatomist of his time. He made major discoveries about the glandular and lymphatic system, as well as about the heart and the brain. But his greatest achievement was developing the theory of sedimentary rocks and the origin of fossils, which unlocked the history of the Earth, and for which he is regarded as one of the principal founders of the science of geology. In fact, most accounts of the history of modern geology start with him. He was converted to the Catholic faith. He was raised Lutheran, became a priest, eventually made a bishop, and was declared blessed by Pope John Paul II. Marin Mersenne, a friar of the Mennonite order, is considered the founder, along with Galileo, of the science of acoustics. For example, he was the first to measure the speed of sound. He also made important contributions to the theory and design of reflecting telescopes. His religious house became a meeting place of famous scientists, and his voluminous correspondence with other scientists was an important means by which they learned of each other's work. The Dictionary of Scientific Biography calls him, quote, one of the architects of the European scientific community. And a recent book by the historian Peter L. Bernstein calls him, quote, the center of the world of science and mathematics, the center of the world of science and mathematics during the first half of the 1600s. Christoph Scheiner, a Jesuit astronomer, was one of the discoverers of sunspots and made the most detailed study of them. Giovanni, there's an extra letter in it. Giovanni Battista Riccioli was an important astronomer. He developed an extensive star catalog. He developed methods for measuring time accurately. And together with his fellow Jesuit Francesco Grimaldi, made the first map of the moon's surface. Most remarkably, he discovered and discussed in some detail the effect in physics that we call the Coriolis effect, 2 centuries before Coriolis. Now, of course, he didn't have Newtonian physics to help him, so his discussion is qualitative, whereas Coriolis' discussion was more quantitative. But Grimaldi, very important figure, discovered the diffraction of light. Diffraction is a very important phenomenon in all branches of physics. And it was discovered by Francesco Grimaldi. It's a phenomenon that shows that light is a wave. And since we now know that all matter is made of waves because of wave-particle duality in quantum mechanics, diffraction is very important in all branches of physics. The Benedictine priest, Benedetto Castelli, a friend and student of Galileo, did foundational work in hydraulics and fluid mechanics. He had 2 famous students. One was Torricelli, who discovered the principle of the barometer, and the other famous student was Bonaventura Cavalieri, also a priest, who made important advances in the development of integral calculus. Here's a quote from Leibniz, one of the discoverers of calculus, paying tribute to Cavalieri. Lorenzo Spallanzani was one of the leading biologists of the 18th century. He did many things, and I don't have time to talk about them. René Just Houy was a French priest who is considered the founder of the science of crystallography. He discovered the fundamental mathematical rules governing crystal structure and classified the crystal structures of all the minerals known in his day. Giuseppe Piazzi was discoverer of Ceres, which he called a planet. Later it was reclassified as an asteroid. It is in the asteroid belt. But recently it's been reclassified as a dwarf planet. It's not really an asteroid. It actually is a planet. And he discovered that in 1801. Angelo Stecchi is one of the founders of modern astrophysics. I wish I could say more about him, but he is, you could argue that he and Fraunhofer really are the founders of astrophysics, a Jesuit priest. His observations he did using a telescope he had built on the roof of the Church of St. Ignatius in Rome. And so it's no longer there, but it's a beautiful church, so if you're in Rome, go visit St. Ignatius. The Czech priest, Bernard Bolzano, was a great mathematician who helped put calculus on a more rigorous foundation. I know many of you have studied calculus, and you know that there was a big issue of whether it made sense to talk about infinitesimal quantities and so on. The 2 main people who put calculus on a rigorous foundation in the 19th century were Weierstrass and Bolzano. And of course, and there's a quote from the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, an outstanding mathematician and possibly the greatest logician in the time between Leibniz and Frege. And last, then there's, of course, Gregor Mendel, founded the whole science of genetics. And last but not least, Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian theoretical physicist and Catholic priest who proposed the Big Bang theory. the central idea in modern cosmology. Okay, it's nice to know he's getting more credit. He was sort of forgotten, not forgotten, but his star is rising because a few years ago, the International Astronomical Union voted overwhelmingly to recommend that the famous Hubble law that describes the expansion of the universe be renamed the Hubble-Lemaitre law, because actually it was proposed by Lemaitre. What a glorious record of achievement. This is just the priests. Professor Lawrence Principe of Johns Hopkins University, a leading historian of science, has written that quote, the Catholic Church has probably been the largest single and longest term patron of science in history. Okay, now I want to turn to, science, to physics. And I have, oh dear, I have about 5 minutes. Okay, I'm going to, I think I started at 5 after. All right, so I hope I've shown you that the record of the Catholic Church and Christianity in general with regard to science is not something to be embarrassed about, but actually something quite glorious. So, in the last part of the talk, I'm going to mention some discoveries of modern physics that seem more in line with a Christian view of the world than with materialism and atheism. For an in-depth discussion, I refer you to my book, Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, which came out in 2003. And also, I hope in the Q&A there'll be a lot more time, because I'm going to skip over some of the physics stuff for reasons of time. But I love to discuss the physics in the Q&A. One discovery of the 20th century had to do with the beginning of the universe. The Jewish and Christian view was that the universe had a temporal beginning. In the beginning, it says in Genesis 1:1. By contrast, the pagan philosophers of antiquity, including Aristotle, believed that the universe had always existed for infinite time. And most modern atheists have preferred that idea as well. As of 100 years ago, the scientific evidence seemed to say that the universe had always existed, that the weight of evidence seemed to point in that direction. And many people came to regard the idea of a beginning as just religious mythology. But now we know that Georges Lemaitre's idea of a Big Bang is correct. There was a Big Bang about 14 billion years ago. That is not disputed. In the standard theory of cosmology, that was the beginning of the universe and of time itself. It is possible that something existed before the Big Bang, but even if that is the case, and probably there's no way to know, but if that is the case, there are some strong theoretical arguments that favor the idea that the universe had a beginning at some point, a finite time ago, whether at the Big Bang or at some earlier time. But the weight of theoretical argument is that the universe had a beginning. The second discovery, the chalk one up for the Jews and the Christians who always said that, and the pagan Greeks, including Aristotle, and modern atheists have said the opposite. A second discovery has to do with our place in the universe. For a long time, atheists have said that the evidence shows that human beings are just a cosmic accident, a fluke in a universe that is totally without purpose. Bertrand Russell said that we are a curious accident in a backwater of the universe. But over the last several decades, physicists and cosmologists have become increasingly aware that many features of the fundamental laws of physics seem to be just right to make the existence of life in the universe, including us, possible. If certain things had been even slightly different about the laws of physics, then we wouldn't be here. These fortuitous features are often called anthropic coincidences. They suggest to many people that we aren't an accident and that the universe does have a purpose, namely that beings like ourselves should arise in it. Now, I should say, and I can talk more in the Q&A, the idea that there were features of the laws of physics that had to be just right to make life possible was often dismissed. People argued, no, that's not true. There are no such coincidences. And if there are, they have no significance. But now, actually, opinion has changed in the last 20 or 30 years. I can tell you some personal anecdotes about that. Now it's admitted by most people, most physicists. For example, the late Stephen Hawking very frankly admits in his last book that there are many features of the laws of physics that, as he put it, seem to be tailor-made to make it possible for us to be here, though he had a natural explanation of that. One could mention many examples. I won't for reason of time. I could give you many examples of such coincidences in the laws of physics. An interesting case is the very size of the universe. Many people have seen the vast size of the universe compared to us as proving that we are insignificant in the cosmic scheme. But actually, the vast size of the universe is a precondition for our being here. It takes billions of years. First, it took billions of years to make the chemical elements that are needed for life. That happens in stars and other astrophysical processes. It takes billions of years for that. Once you have all the chemical elements you need, it takes billions of years of biological evolution to make complex living things like ourselves. So you need the universe to last for billions of years if we're going to appear on the scene. But Einstein's theory of gravity relates the longevity of a universe and its size. If a universe has to reach the immense proportions that ours is, if it is to last for billions of years. So far from pointing to our insignificance, the vastness of the universe is a precondition for us being here. Now, there is a naturalistic way to account for some of the anthropic coincidences, and that's called the multiverse idea, which is not a foolish idea at all. And if you want to discuss that, I will do that in the Q&A. A third development is that physicists have found that the laws of physics are based on very deep mathematical ideas. So, for example, Kepler's laws of planetary motion are very beautiful mathematically, but the mathematics is not deep. You could explain the relevant algebra and geometry to a middle schooler or a high school student in half an hour. You need a little algebra. You need to be able to write. This third law requires a little algebraic equation, and you have to teach the kid what an ellipse is. No, I mean, it's very easy. You put two, there are very easy ways, Now, but Kepler's laws are based on deeper laws, which are Newton's laws of mechanics and gravity. You can derive Kepler's laws from Newton's laws, which are deeper, more fundamental. There you need to know calculus. So you're now talking about a college freshman or maybe an advanced high school senior. But Newton's law of gravity is really just an approximation to a deeper law, which is Einstein's theory of gravity. Now, to understand Einstein's theory of gravity fully, you have to know about tensor analysis, and you have to know about curved Minkowskian four-dimensional space-time and differential geometry and stuff that typically, if you learn it at all, and most people with PhDs in physics never take a course in it, but if you learn it at all, it's usually in graduate school. And now it is believed that Einstein's theory of gravity is actually just an approximation to something yet deeper, which in all likelihood probably is something called superstring theory, which is so deep mathematically that those physicists have been studying it very intensively since 1984. They will admit to you that they have only scratched the surface of its mathematical depths. Okay, does this not suggest that a mind much greater than ours came up with those laws? The more deeply physics has probed the inner workings of the physical world, the more profound and intricate the mathematical structure it has uncovered. The architecture of the physical world is not based on the mere amalgamation of simple stuff, but on mathematically rich ideas. As long ago as 1931, published in 1932, a great mathematician, Hermann Weyl, who also made very important contributions to fundamental physics, said this in a lecture at Yale University. Many people think that modern science is far removed from God. I find, on the contrary, that it is much more difficult today for the knowing person to approach God from history, from the spiritual side of the world, and from morals. For there we encounter the suffering and evil in the world, which it is difficult to bring into harmony with an all-merciful and almighty God. In this domain, we have evidently not yet succeeded in raising the veil with which our human nature covers the essence of things. But in our knowledge of physical nature, we have penetrated so far that we can obtain a vision of the flawless harmony, which is in conformity with sublime reason. Now, Weyl was a Christian, so for him, the sublime reason was the logos. Now, finally, and this is the end of my talk, there are discoveries in the 20th century that may have something to say about whether we are just material beings made of atoms. One of those discoveries is quantum mechanics. According to some of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, quantum mechanics implies that the human mind is not just something physical. There is more to it than can be explained by the motion of atoms, governed by the laws of physics. Now, I can't, in the time remaining, even if you gave me 20 minutes, explain why people think that quantum mechanics, some people have argued that quantum mechanics implies that our minds are not purely physical. But I will just quote a couple of great physicists. Sir Rudolf Peierls, one of the great physicists of the 20th century, the premise, and he was basing this on quantum mechanics. He was being interviewed about quantum mechanics. He said, the premise that you can describe in terms of physics, the whole function of a human being, including its knowledge and consciousness, is untenable. He said there is still something missing. The physics does not describe the whole human being, including its knowledge. Eugene P. Wigner, a Nobel Prize winner in physics, said that materialism is, quote, inconsistent with present quantum mechanics. An eminent philosopher of science, Hans Halvorson of Princeton, not a physicist but a philosopher, in the case of quantum mechanics, if one presupposes physicalism, i.e. everything is physical, then one quickly lands in the measurement problem. So there's a very respectable argument, never been refuted, that quantum mechanics is inconsistent with materialism. So let me end where I started. Not only has religion, and Christianity in particular, including the Catholic Church, been a great friend of science and played a very positive role in its history, but the things discovered by science, contrary to what many people think, have actually in many ways, especially 20th century discoveries, tended to agree on some fundamental religious ideas about the universe and our place within it. Thank you.